I want to take a look at a king and pawn endgame that occurred in the Norway chess tournament yesterday. White was Firouzja and Carlsen played black. Carlsen takes the h-pawn with his knight, trades minor pieces, and goes into this king and pawn endgame a pawn up. It's completely drawn though, even though black has this extra pawn. This pawn is backwards, and it's hard to get a winning king and pawn versus king endgame. If this pawn pushes forward, white can capture it. Black can recapture and have that extra pawn, but the white king will be in time to get in front of it. Okay, so what does white do here? Well, throughout this endgame, it's important that white keeps the opposition, or if not the opposition, the distant opposition or even the long distant opposition. White needs to keep the black king out of his position. If you ignore the backward pawn and just look at the locked pawns, then black has some key squares that he'd like to get his king to. On this side of the board, these are the three key squares. If black can get his king on one of those three key squares, he'll be able to win white's pawn. On the other side of the board, these are the three key squares. If the king makes his way over to that side, the white king has to defend the black king from arriving on one of these three key squares, from which he will win the pawn. With the extra pawn, black sometimes has another resource of pushing it forward if this king is out of place and not prepared to stop the remaining pawn. So here, white must play king to h3, grabbing the opposition. It's the only way to be sure to keep black out of these key squares. If he moves over here, black is going to get a key square and win this pawn. In fact, let's see how black can win that pawn by outmaneuvering the white king. Okay, let's just take one particular path here. And now in this position, white can no longer stay in contact with this pawn and black will win it. Okay, so backing up, white correctly played king to h3 to grab the opposition and protect the key squares. Okay, Carlsen moved his king around, and Carlsen remarked, I read this in the Chess Base report, that he knew, of course, this is a drawn endgame, but Firouzja's clock was very low. At some point it was below 5 seconds. I don't know what the increment was, or if there was an increment. He also noticed Firouzja was very nervous. So chess sometimes comes down to quick thinking, reflexes, and nerves. You can't always just rely on logic and rational thought in a chess game. So here, after king h6, white wisely moves up and grabs the opposition again. Turns out king to h2 would also draw, and this is called the distant opposition with three squares between the king. And then if the black king comes up, then the white king can come up correspondingly and grab the opposition and protect the key squares again. Okay. But after king h6, king h4 was played. Carlsen decides to dance around with his king and test Firouzja in time pressure. He plays king g7. Firouzja wisely falls back king g3, realizing he wants this distant opposition. In fact, that's the only move to draw the position. Let's look at some other attempts to see what would happen. If Firouzja comes up with his king, king to h5, then one winning move here is king to f7, and this king can run for the other side of the pawn towards those key squares. Maybe the white king hangs around and tries to win the f-pawn and then the e-pawn, or maybe it runs back to protect those key squares. Let's take a look at the possible move king to h6, moving up the board again. Well, if you go up the board too far, then black can push their pawn. f5 is going to win here. The white king can't come back in time. It can try king to g5, but then f takes e4 wins because this square is controlled. So black will be able to come up and support his pawns. So if you go up the board too far, black pushing the pawn is going to win. What about the move king to g4, turning back around in this position? Well, then black can play king to e6, heading towards these squares. Maybe king f3 running to protect them. King d6. Now, if white continues to run this way, there's no way he's going to stop black from getting to b4. He's 4 moves away from that square, and black is only 2. So white is going to lose the race if he tries to protect these 3 key squares. So perhaps he turns back around and heads for this f-pawn and tries to win it. Well, then we're going to see another tactic, king c5, and he's heading for these key squares, and he's going to win this e-pawn. White's only hope is to win the f-pawn and then the e5 pawn. So white can head for that, but looking at these locked pawns again, white just stepped onto a trebuchet. This is called a trebuchet tactic, and black moves to the corresponding square in this trebuchet, and that forces the white king to abandon control of his pawn on e4, and then black wins it. And since black is ahead of his pawn, he's going to be able to queen it. Okay, going back to this position where Carlsen moved king to g7, we'll look at one more try by white. We know that king to g3, grabbing the distant opposition, is the only drawing move. What if he had played king to g4? This seems to protect the key squares just fine. Well, then Carlsen can move up and grab the opposition himself, forcing the white king aside. Maybe king h4, allowing black to push his f-pawn. Okay, and if white falls back, like here, then black can continue to grab that opposition, and now white is forced one way or the other, and the black king will get one of the 3 key squares. So moving aside to h4 allows black to push his f-pawn again. And then e takes f5, king takes f5, and the white king cannot come back in time to stop this from occurring. And now the black king is on one of the 3 key squares of his pawn, and so it will queen. If you're not sure about what I'm talking about with regard to key squares, I'll put links in the description to some king and pawn endgames that I made videos for earlier. Okay, so going back to king to g7, Firouzja did play wisely with king to g3. So he establishes he understands the opposition and distant opposition and the desire to play it in this kind of a position. Carlsen plays king to f8. King to f2 grabs what we call the long distant opposition with 5 squares between the kings. It's a good move. King to f3 would have drawn as well. King to e7, king to e2, king to e3 would have been a drawing move. But I will point out that king to f3 actually loses. The white king had to move towards the left of the board because after king to f3, the black king can rush toward that b4 key square, and white is not in time to protect it. So again, the black king is going to outflank the white king here and win that e-pawn. Okay. So going back, Firouzja did play correctly king to e2, king to e8, king to e3, king to d7. King to d3, it's wise to grab this distant opposition here. You're trying to protect these key squares. Now king to d6, and the move here should be pretty obvious if you've been trying to gain the opposition and the distant opposition. The correct move is king to d2. Okay? Although in time pressure I understand making a blunder. Any other move in that position actually loses. It is counterintuitive to move backwards, but you have to do it to gain this distant opposition. The point is, if the black king now tries to come up, then the white king can go up correspondingly and grab the opposition and protect the key squares. Okay, Firouzja made the mistake of playing king to c3 in this position, and then Carlsen grabs the opposition with king to c5, and white resigned. So white can't protect the key squares anymore. If he moves over here, black's going to grab that b4 square. Just to show one other losing move after black moves up to d6 in this position, king to c4 would also lose, which is kind of strange. Moving up right onto the key squares is losing, and here's why it loses. Black can run the other way, king to e6. Okay, so white has come too far, made too much progress up and left here. And then after king to e6, maybe the white king runs back to defend the queen side of the board, but then king to f7, king to e3, king to g6, king to f3, king to h5, heading for that key square. White needs to protect it with king to g3, but then black grabs the opposition, and white has to step aside and give ground, and black has a key square. So going all the way back to this position after king to d6, again, the only drawing move is king to d2. King to c3 allows black to get the opposition, and king to c4 is actually just too greedy. Black just runs the other way and grabs a key square over here. All right, so that is how the game ended. King c3, king c5, and white resigned. Thanks for watching the video.